I'd spent 12 months working 14-hour days under the Dubai sun, dreaming of the quiet hilltop I'd inherited in Riverside County. The desert heat strips you down to who you really are. It doesn't care about your car, your salary, or the title on your badge. Just hammers you with light until you learn what matters. For me, it was 5 acres of California wild grass where my grandmother taught me silence was sacred. Comment below if you've ever had someone steal your peace while you were busy surviving. When I finally made it home, the silence was gone. 12 Mediterranean mansions sprawled across my land like expensive tombstones. The HOA thought I'd vanished forever. Another absentee owner crushed by foreign heat. They forgot something important. The desert doesn't break everyone. Sometimes it just teaches you that paperwork and petty tyrants are nothing compared to staying alive at 50 degrees Celsius. They stole from the wrong engineer. The Dubai sun had been relentless for 12 months, but nothing compared to the heat rising in my chest as I stood at the entrance to what used to be empty land. My name is Jonathan Stewart, and until 5 minutes ago, I thought I owned 5 acres of undeveloped property in Riverside County. California, my grandmother Dorothy had left it to me 3 years ago, her final gift to her only grandchild. Now, staring at the ornate iron gates of Willowbrook Estates, I felt like I'd driven into an alternate universe where my inheritance had been replaced by 12 Mediterranean mansions. The security guard stepped out of his booth, adjusting his uniform as he approached my idling Honda. Marcus, according to his name tag, looked about 25 and uncomfortable with confrontation. "Can I help you, sir? This is a private community. Are you here to visit someone?" I rolled down my window fully, letting the November air cut through the car's sterile atmosphere. "I'm here to visit my property. All of this is built on my land." Marcus blinked, clearly processing a situation that wasn't in his training manual. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is Willowbrook Estates. All the properties here are privately owned by residents." Before I could respond, a golf cart hummed up the manicured drive. The woman driving it looked like she'd been poured into her pastel pink blazer and had set like concrete. Her blonde hair defied both wind and logic, and her smile preceded her like a warning shot. "Is there a problem, Marcus?" she asked, though her eyes had already locked onto mine with predatory focus. A name tag identified her as Rachel Anderson, HOA president. She clutched a manila folder against her chest like it contained state secrets. "This gentleman claims he owns our entire development," Marcus explained, shifting nervously. Rachel's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Oh, another one. How delightful." She turned that dental display toward me. Sir, I'm going to ask you to leave immediately. This is private property, and your fraudulent claims constitute trespassing." I forced myself to breathe, channeling the patience that had kept me sane during 14-hour days debugging banking software. "I inherited this land from Dorothy Stewart 3 years ago. I have all the documentation. I've been overseas on a critical work assignment." Rachel raised a manicured hand like she was directing traffic. "Whatever documents you think you have are irrelevant. This property was legally developed under California's abandoned property statutes, specifically Civil Code Section 3495.1. The specific code number rolled off her tongue with practiced ease, and I noticed how her fingers drummed against the folder, not nervously, but rhythmically, like someone counting beats. Abandonment was established through proper legal channels. No tax payments, no maintenance, no registered caretaker. The county health department declared it a fire hazard and public nuisance. "I set up automatic tax payments," I said, but doubt was already creeping in. I'd been so focused on the Dubai project that I hadn't checked my U.S. finances in months. Rachel's expression suggested she knew exactly what I'd find. "Electronic payments require periodic verification under new federal banking regulations, without proper oversight." She shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both sympathy and satisfaction. Behind her, a construction truck rumbled through the gates. Anderson Construction, emblazoned on its side. Anderson, like Rachel Anderson. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. "I want to see the paperwork," I said. Voice steady, despite the rage building in my chest. "The abandonment declaration, court orders, development permits, all of it." Rachel's grip on her folder tightened until her knuckles went white. "You're not entitled to anything. Mr. Stewart, you're not a resident here. Marcus, please escort this gentleman off the premises. If he returns, contact the sheriff immediately." She spun on her designer heels, but not before I caught her glancing at the construction truck a quick, checking look, like making sure an accomplice was in position. Marcus looked genuinely apologetic as he motioned for me to leave. "I'm sorry, sir. I just work here." He glanced around, then leaned closer to my window. "The county recorder's office is open until 5. All the property transfers would be there, public records and all that." He straightened quickly as Rachel's golf cart stopped halfway to the community center, her head turning back toward us. "You need to go now, sir. Please." I nodded, putting the car in reverse. As I backed away from the gates, I took in every detail. The houses were new but not brand new, maybe 8 months old, judging by the landscaping. More telling was the sales office near the entrance, a temporary structure with maps and price sheets visible through its windows. They weren't just stealing my land, they were still selling it. One poster advertised Phase 2 coming soon, with an architect's rendering of 6 more houses. My stomach turned. They weren't satisfied with 12 mansions. They wanted to cover every inch of my grandmother's wilderness. The anger that had been building since I first saw those gates crystallized into something harder, colder. Rachel Anderson thought she'd stolen from some absent heir too far away to fight back. She had the specific code numbers memorized. The folder clutched like armor. The practiced speech about abandonment. This wasn't her first time, but it would be her last. At least with my land. I'd spent a year solving impossible problems in impossible heat, stripping away everything non-essential until only competence remained. She'd built her mansions on my inheritance, but she'd also built a paper trail, and paper trails were just another kind of code to debug. I pulled onto the main road, already planning my next moves. County recorder first, then a lawyer, then whatever it took to reclaim what was mine. Those 12 houses gleaming in the California sun weren't monuments to her cleverness. They were evidence. Rachel Anderson had made one crucial mistake. She'd left me alive and angry. In Dubai, I'd learned that the only way to survive crushing pressure was to become harder than whatever was trying to crush you. She was about to learn that lesson too. Only her teacher would be the California legal system, and I'd be writing the curriculum. The Willowbrook Estates HOA office occupied the top floor of what they called the community center, a gleaming glass and stone building that probably cost more than most people's homes. I arrived at 9 a.m. sharp on Tuesday, having spent Monday at the county recorder's office discovering just how thoroughly I'd been robbed. My lawyer, Denise Walker, sat beside me in the elevator, reviewing the documents we'd gathered. She was 62, black, and had spent 30 years fighting property fraud in California. When I'd shown her the paperwork, she'd actually whistled. "Haven't seen a grab this bold in a decade," she'd said. "They usually at least try to hide it better." The elevator opened onto a reception area that looked like it belonged in a Fortune 500 company, not a homeowners association. The receptionist, a young man with perfectly styled hair, looked up from his computer with practiced concern. "Do you have an appointment?" I held up the formal letter Denise had sent demanding this meeting. "Jonathan Stewart, we're expected." His face went pale as he recognized my name. Apparently, word had spread about the rightful owner showing up. "One moment, please." and he practically ran to the back offices. Rachel Anderson emerged wearing a powder blue blazer, flanked by 3 other board members and a man in an expensive suit who had lawyer written all over him. "Mr. Stewart," she said, gesturing toward a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking my land. "Let's clarify the situation." The view was calculated my grandmother's oaks perfectly framed, now surrounding someone's pool. We sat across from them at a mahogany table that probably cost more than my car. "Your automatic payments ceased 13 months ago when your bank account was closed for inactivity," Rachel began, sliding a notice across the table. Throughout her speech, her right thumb repeatedly clicked a retractable pen, click, 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 the only sign that she wasn't as calm as she appeared. "The county followed standard procedure for tax-delinquent properties." Her lawyer, Bradley Henderson, according to his business card, nodded along like a well-trained puppet. Denise leaned forward, her reading glasses catching the light. Interesting that someone paid the back taxes in full just 1 day before the county auction would have occurred. Paid by Anderson Construction, Inc. She produced her own documents. "Your brother's company, I believe." Rachel's thumb clicked faster. Click, 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 click. "Robert Anderson runs a successful construction company that specializes in revitalizing abandoned properties. When the county approached us about this public nuisance, we saw an opportunity to create homes where there was only neglect. That land was designated as agricultural preserve," I said. Rachel's pen clicking stopped entirely. She opened her folder and extracted a single sheet. "About that designation, no such preservation status was ever officially recorded. We have an affidavit from the county clerk confirming this." She slid the paper across. Thomas Wright's signature at the bottom. The same Thomas Wright who'd retired suddenly last year with a new vacation home in Tahoe. "Curious that the quiet title action was filed in San Bernardino County," Denise noted, pulling out her phone to show a photo of the legal notice. "Buried on page 17 of a paper with 300 circulation, and this bank closure notice dated 2 weeks before the account should have been flagged for inactivity." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as the implications hung in the air. Rachel stood abruptly, the other board members rising in unison. Her pen clicking resumed, now a rapid staccato. "Mr. Stewart abandoned his property. We followed every legal requirement. If you wish to pursue this matter further, contact our attorneys." Henderson handed Denise his card with a smirk that said he thought he'd won. But I noticed something he'd missed, one of the board members. An older woman with silver hair had been taking notes throughout the meeting. When Rachel stood, she'd closed her notebook quickly, but not before I saw she'd written "Agricultural Preserve" and circled it 3 times. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before she looked away, a crack in their united front. As we walked to the elevator, Denise was actually humming. "Did you catch the dates?" she asked once the doors closed. Wright's affidavit was sworn January 15th, but the county record wasn't changed until March. They prepared that document before they knew they'd need it. That's conspiracy, not opportunity. The elevator descended through floors built on my stolen land. Each level represented another family who'd bought into Rachel's lie, another mortgage on property that might not legally exist. "What's next?" I asked as we reached the parking lot. Denise pulled out her keys, that little smile still playing on her lips. "Now we find the original agricultural preserve document, because I guarantee it exists. Probably in the same place they hid the real property transfer records." She paused at her car, studying me with eyes that had seen too many broken property owners. They made one mistake. Jonathan. They got greedy. 12 houses when 6 would have been safer. A rush job on the paperwork when patience would have covered their tracks. That pen clicking. She knows they pushed too hard. Denise opened her door, then turned back. "Write down everything you remember about your grandmother's preserve application. Every detail. Because when we find that document, this whole development becomes an illegal structure on protected land. And that's not just fraud, that's federal crime. She drove away, leaving me standing in a parking lot that used to be wild grassland, staring up at a building that shouldn't exist. My phone buzzed with a text from Denise. Check your grandmother's safety deposit box. Old school people didn't trust computers. Of course, Grandma Dorothy had lived through the Depression, had seen banks fail and records disappear. She would have kept physical copies of everything important. The key was on my keychain, had been there for 3 years, waiting, just like the land had been waiting. Patient, under the weight of stolen houses, for someone to come home and set things right. I drove toward Bank of America, where Grandma had kept that box for 40 years. The branch was old, one of the few that survived corporate consolidation, its vault dating back to the 1950s. As I waited for the banker to retrieve the box, I thought about that silver-haired board member and her nervous note-taking. Rachel Anderson had built her scheme on the assumption that everyone was either complicit or powerless. But doubt was like water, it found cracks in any foundation. The banker returned with a metal box that felt heavier than its size suggested. Privacy room is to your left. Mr. Stewart, take all the time you need. Inside that small, windowless room, I opened my grandmother's last secrets. On top was a letter in her careful script, Jonathan. If you're reading this, someone probably tried to take the land. Check the blue folder. My hands shook as I found a faded blue folder labeled Agricultural Preserve Application, 1987. Inside were the original documents, the official stamps, the state approval, everything Thomas Wright had sworn never existed. But there was more. Underneath the preserve documents was a second folder. This one read, labeled simply Insurance. Inside were photographs my grandmother standing with Thomas Wright at a county function in 1995. A Christmas card. The Wright family. A note in Wright's own hand, Dorothy. Thanks for your patience with the zoning review. Your preserve status is safe with me. What my grandmother had known. Somehow, she'd known to keep evidence of her relationship with the very man who would one day betray her trust. I photographed everything with my phone, then carefully returned the originals to their folders. These documents were more than proof, they were weapons. Rachel Anderson had built her empire on the assumption that the past could be erased with enough money and influence. She'd forgotten that some people prepare for war even in peacetime. My grandmother had been one of those people. Now, sitting in a bank vault with her legacy in my hands, I understood why she'd always said the land knew how to take care of itself. She'd made sure of it. The Bank of America vault had yielded more than documents, it had given me a road map. Back in my apartment that evening, I spread everything across my dining table like a general planning a campaign. The agricultural preserve documents were the smoking gun, but Grandma's insurance folder was the ammunition. She'd kept records of every interaction with county officials, every letter about the land, every receipt for property taxes paid. It was as if she'd known someone would eventually try to steal what she'd protected. Denise arrived at 7, bringing Chinese takeout and a portable scanner. We digitize everything tonight, she said, setting up the equipment. Physical documents can disappear, but encrypted files on multiple servers are forever. As we worked methodically through the stack, she explained our next moves. Tomorrow we file a lis pendens, that's a notice that the property's ownership is in dispute. It'll freeze any new sales and put every current owner on notice that their titles might be worthless. The thought of 12 families discovering they'd bought stolen property made my stomach turn. But Denise was pragmatic. They're victims too, but that's what title insurance is for. And the scanning process revealed the most damning evidence yet: a canceled check from 2020, made out to Marcus Webb, a private investigator. The memo line read, Property Protection Research. My grandmother had hired someone to investigate the very people now squatting on her land. We need to find Webb tomorrow. Denise said, adding the check to our priority folder. Whatever he discovered might still be relevant. Another document stopped us both cold correspondence from the state's Agricultural Land Trust, showing Grandma had tried to put the land into a permanent conservation easement in 1987. The application was approved preliminarily, but never finalized due to administrative complications. Thomas Wright's signature appeared at the bottom. My phone rang as we were finishing. Unknown number, local area code. Mr. Stewart, this is Patricia Coleman. I was at the meeting today, the board member taking notes. I remembered the silver-haired woman who'd circled Agricultural Preserve 3 times. I shouldn't be calling, but my conscience. Can we meet tomorrow morning? 9 a.m. Riverside Diner on University Avenue. Come alone. She hung up before I could respond. Denise raised an eyebrow. Our first insider. This could break everything open. By 3 a.m. Unable to sleep. I'd built a complete timeline on my laptop. The pattern was undeniable. Wright had been blocking conservation efforts since 1987. Anderson Construction requested property records in 2019. Grandma hired the PI in 2020. She died in 2021. I left for Dubai in 2022. They filed for abandonment in 2023. Built houses the same year. 35 years of patience, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The Riverside Diner at 9 a.m. was nearly empty, just truckers and insomniacs. Patricia Coleman slid into the booth across from me, clutching a manila envelope. I've been on the board for 10 years. She began without preamble. Everything changed when Rachel became president 3 years ago. She pushed the envelope across the table, handwritten meeting notes, not the sanitized official minutes. Your property was what she called the crown jewel. She knew about the preserve status. They all did. Wright promised to handle the technicalities. I scanned the notes quickly. Rachel had identified 5 properties in Riverside County with exploitable preservation restrictions. Mine was the test case. Last month, she started talking about Phase 2. Patricia continued, voice dropping. 6 more houses on your land. They're not done. She stood to leave but paused. Mr. Stewart, Rachel's husband is James Anderson, the federal judge. The name hit like a physical blow. But judges can go to prison too, she added quietly, if the crime is big enough. Then she was gone. I called Denise from the parking lot. We need the FBI. This is a federal judge's wife running a criminal conspiracy. Denise's response was immediate. Come to my office now. Take surface streets. If Patricia's right, you're on their radar. I started my car, suddenly aware of every vehicle behind me. The stakes had just escalated beyond property fraud to federal corruption. Back at Denise's office. We worked quickly. She placed calls while I organized Patricia's notes chronologically with our other evidence. The FBI's Riverside office can see us at 2, she announced. White-collar crime unit. They're very interested in the judicial connection. We spent the next hour preparing our presentation, focusing on the clear pattern of corruption that reached from the county clerk's office to the federal bench. At noon, Denise's investigator called with Marcus Webb's location. He was still working, based in San Bernardino. He remembers the Stewart case. The investigator reported. Says he has a file that certain people tried to buy from him. He's willing to meet. We arranged for the following morning, after our FBI appointment. The pieces were falling into place faster than Rachel Anderson could have imagined. One more thing, Denise said as we prepared to leave for the FBI. I ran a property search this morning. Rachel and James Anderson own 14 properties in 3 counties, all acquired in the last 5 years, all in areas with resolved title disputes. Your grandmother's land wasn't their first theft, just their most ambitious. She pulled up a map on her computer, showing the properties marked in red. The pattern was obvious rural land, with preservation restrictions or elderly owners, transformed into luxury developments. The FBI office was in a nondescript building downtown, all beige walls and security checkpoints. Special Agent Sarah Foster led us to an interview room where another agent was already setting up recording equipment. Ms. Walker briefed us on the basics, Foster said, arranging our documents on the table. A federal judge's spouse allegedly involved in systematic property fraud is exactly the kind of case we're mandated to investigate. She studied the agricultural preserve documents, then Patricia's notes. This board member, Patricia Coleman, would she testify? I nodded. She came forward voluntarily. She knew Dorothy Stewart personally. Agent Foster exchanged glances with her partner. We'll need to move quickly once we officially open this. Judge Anderson has significant influence, but that also means significant exposure if he knew about his wife's activities. She gathered our documents carefully. We'll initiate surveillance immediately. Keep your phones on. Don't discuss this with anyone except Ms. Walker. And Mr. Stewart. She met my eyes directly. Vary your routines. These people have already proven they'll wait years for an opportunity. Don't give them one. We left the FBI office as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across downtown Riverside. In 48 hours, I'd gone from a shocked property owner to a federal witness, somewhere across town. Rachel Anderson was probably reviewing plans for Phase 2, unaware that the FBI was about to make her the star of their own investigation. The paper trail that started in my grandmother's safety deposit box had led to a federal case that would expose decades of corruption. Tomorrow we'd meet with the private investigator who'd tried to protect my grandmother's land 3 years ago. Tonight, I'd sleep knowing that 12 mansions built on stolen dreams were about to become evidence in a federal crime. Marcus Webb's office occupied the second floor of a strip mall in San Bernardino, sandwiched between a tax preparer and a yoga studio. The morning after our FBI meeting, Denise and I climbed the narrow stairs to find a door marked simply Webb Investigations. The man who answered our knock was in his 60s, built like an ex-cop, with eyes that missed nothing. "Jonathan Stewart," he said before I could introduce myself. "You look like Dorothy. Same eyes, same stubborn set to the jaw. Come in." His office was organized chaos, filing cabinets lining every wall, bulletin boards covered in photos and documents, the desk of someone who understood that information was power. Webb gestured us to chairs and pulled a thick folder from a cabinet behind him. "Your grandmother hired me in January of 2020 after receiving a lowball offer from Anderson Construction. Something about it bothered her, so she asked me to investigate." He opened the folder, revealing photographs, financial documents, and surveillance reports. Robert Anderson isn't just Rachel's brother. He's her business partner in a scheme that goes back 15 years. They identify properties with complications, preservation status, elderly owners, unclear titles, and then they wait. When the owner dies or leaves, they pounce. I documented 17 properties they've acquired using variations of the same playbook. Webb spread out a series of photographs showing different developments, each one a monument to calculated theft. The financial spreadsheet he produced next made my engineer's brain light up with recognition. Anderson Construction never uses its own money. Each project is funded by different LLCs registered in Nevada, all traced back to Willowbrook Investment Partners. The registered owner, James Anderson. The federal judge has been funding his wife's property theft empire through shell companies. Money flows from legitimate sources into investment accounts, then to Nevada LLCs, then to Anderson Construction as development loans, then back as profits from sales. Conservative estimate $40 million in stolen property, over $100 million in development profits. Denise was taking notes furiously. "This is RICO territory." Webb nodded grimly. "That's what I told Dorothy. But she was already sick by then. She paid me to document everything and told me to wait. Said her grandson would know when to use it." He pulled out another document, a list titled Future Opportunities, in Rachel's handwriting. 43 properties in 3 counties, all with elderly owners or preservation restrictions. My grandmother's land was marked Priority 1. "Why didn't you take this to authorities?" I asked. Webb's expression darkened. "I tried. The first detective I approached got transferred suddenly. The second stopped returning my calls. The third told me bluntly that without a victim willing to prosecute, there was nothing to investigate." He produced a USB drive next. Audio recordings from public meetings. Rachel discussing your grandmother at a planning commission meeting in 2019. She calls her an obstacle to progress and jokes that nature will solve the problem soon enough. James Anderson is on that recording too, suggesting they be patient with the Stewart situation. Webb pulled out one final item, a photograph that stopped my breath. It showed my grandmother standing on her land in 2019. In the background, barely visible, was a surveyor's truck with Anderson Construction logos. They were measuring her property while she was still alive. She saw them that day, called me right after. That's when she knew they wouldn't wait for her to sell. The image captured everything my grandmother's defiance. The vultures circling. The land they coveted spread out behind her. Denise stood up, phone in hand. "We need to get this to the FBI immediately." Webb smiled grimly. "Already done. I sent copies to Agent Foster this morning. Also sent backups to 3 other locations, including my attorney. Last week, someone tried to break into my office. Nothing taken. But they were looking for something. I think they know I have this file." The drive back to Riverside took us through neighborhoods that looked different, now that I understood the pattern. How many of these developments sat on stolen land? How many elderly owners had been pressured, tricked, or simply outlasted? Denise made calls while I drove, coordinating with Foster and preparing for whatever came next. "The FBI wants us to maintain normal routines," she said after hanging up. "They're building arrest warrants, but it takes time to coordinate a takedown this big." My phone rang as we reached Denise's office. Agent Foster's voice was all business. "Mr. Stewart, we've reviewed the Webb materials. We're upgrading this to a joint task force investigation with the IRS and postal inspectors. The judge's financial disclosures have been falsified for years. We're executing search warrants tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., multiple locations simultaneously." She paused. "Federal judges require special handling. We're working with the Judicial Ethics Committee and Maine Justice. But he won't be presiding over any cases after tomorrow." That afternoon, unable to sit still, I drove to the County Hall of Records. Something Patricia Coleman had mentioned about Phase 2 nagged at me. The clerk, a young woman named Jennifer, became very helpful when I mentioned the Stewart property. "Oh, that development. Yeah, there were some permits filed last week. Preliminary stuff for 6 more houses." She pulled up the records on her screen. Weird though the permits reference parcel numbers that don't match the current plot maps. She showed me the screen, and I immediately saw what they were doing. They were already subdividing my land for Phase 2, creating fictional parcel numbers for houses on land they didn't own. "Can I get copies of these?" I asked. She nodded, hitting print. "Actually, someone else was asking about these yesterday. Official-looking guy from Anderson Construction. Wanted to know if anyone had been requesting records for that property." The implications chilled me. They were checking to see how much I'd discovered. I texted Denise and Foster immediately with photos of the permits. Foster's response was swift. "This shows ongoing criminal activity. Helps establish intent. Good find." I left the county building through a different exit than I'd entered, doubling back twice on the route home. No one followed, but the feeling of exposure persisted. Back in my apartment, I found myself studying the permits more closely. They weren't just planning 6 more houses, they were planning an entire second phase that would completely cover the remaining land. Swimming pools where my grandmother had grown vegetables. Tennis courts where the old oak grove stood. A clubhouse on the exact spot where she used to watch sunsets. They weren't just stealing land, they were erasing every trace of what it had been. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Stewart, this is Patricia Coleman. Urgent. Rachel called an emergency board meeting for tonight. Something about protecting HOA assets from frivolous litigation. She's also moving money. I heard her on the phone with their accountant about liquidating accounts. I think they know about the FBI." I forwarded the message to Foster and got an immediate response. "Surveillance teams confirm unusual activity at Anderson residence. They're shredding documents. We're moving the timeline up. Raids commence at 4 a.m. Be ready for potential witness intimidation. Local PD will increase patrols near your residence." Another text followed. "Do not attempt to observe the raids. They'll have news coverage. Stay home. Stay safe." Sleep was impossible. I sat at my kitchen table, going through everything we'd gathered. Webb's investigation, my grandmother's documents, Patricia's notes, the fraudulent permits, each piece built the case higher. At 2 a.m., I made coffee and opened my laptop, creating a comprehensive timeline of everything we'd discovered. If something happened to me, I wanted the full story documented and backed up to multiple cloud services. At 3:30 a.m., my phone rang. Foster's voice was clipped, professional. "We're going in. Federal marshals are positioned at all locations. 12 properties will be raided simultaneously, including the Anderson residence, HOA offices, Anderson Construction Headquarters, and Judge Anderson's chambers at the federal courthouse. By sunrise, the Anderson Crime Network will be in custody. Local news has been alerted to the courthouse location, only they'll have their story, but won't interfere with residential raids." I moved to my window, looking east toward where my grandmother's land lay under those stolen houses. Somewhere in Willowbrook Estates, federal agents were taking positions. At Anderson Construction, investigators were preparing to seize years of fraudulent documents. The elaborate scheme that had stolen 17 properties and laundered millions through a federal judge's investment accounts was about to collapse spectacularly. As the first hints of dawn touched the sky, I thought about my grandmother standing on her land, watching those surveyors measure what they planned to steal. She'd known this moment would come, had paid Webb to ensure it would. Now, 3 years after her death, and 1 year after they'd built on her land, justice was arriving with federal warrants and handcuffs. The houses built on stolen dreams were about to become crime scenes. And the woman who'd orchestrated it all was about to learn that even federal judges couldn't protect her from the weight of evidence we'd assembled. My phone lit up with a text from Denise. "Turn on Channel 7. And the breaking news banner read, "Federal raids underway in Riverside County. Judge's wife arrested in major property fraud scheme." The war was over. We'd won. The federal raids made the morning news cycle with the force of an earthquake. I sat in my living room, coffee growing cold in my hands, watching footage of agents carrying boxes from the Anderson home. Rachel, still in her silk pajamas, was led out in handcuffs, her perfectly styled hair finally disheveled. The cameras caught her screaming at agents about lawsuits and connections, but her threats dissolved into the morning air like mist. By 8 a.m., Denise was at my door with fresh information. 27 arrests so far, she announced, setting up her laptop on my dining table. The Andersons, Roberts Construction Management, 3 county officials including Thomas Wright, and 2 other HOA presidents from neighboring counties. She pulled up a federal filing on her screen. "The task force is calling it Operation Stolen Ground," Agent Foster called while we were reviewing the arrest list. "Mr. Stewart, we need you at the federal building by 10. Bring all original documents. The prosecutor wants to walk through the timeline with you directly." She paused, voices audible in the background. "Patricia Coleman has agreed to testify. She's providing information about HOA operations we hadn't suspected, apparently. Your case was meant to fund an expansion into Arizona and Nevada." The federal building in downtown Riverside buzzed with activity. Security whisked us through a side entrance and up to a conference room where Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen waited with his team. "Mr. Stewart, Ms. Walker, what you've uncovered isn't just property fraud. It's one of the largest judicial corruption cases in California history. Based on this morning's evidence, we've identified similar operations in 11 states. We found training materials where they coached other HOA boards on property acquisition strategies. Your grandmother's investigation exposed a national crime syndicate. Chen showed us evidence from Judge Anderson's chamber's detailed investment records dating back 15 years. In one email, he calculates his expected return from your grandmother's land at $12 million. The number stung, but Chen moved quickly to new revelations. More importantly, Cyber Division just intercepted him trying to access offshore accounts from federal custody. We've frozen another $40 million in Grand Cayman and Swiss banks. Patricia Coleman arrived as we were reviewing financial documents, looking pale but determined. Rachel kept 2 sets of books, she explained, producing copies she'd made during the emergency meeting. One for the HOA board, one for the investment committee, just her, Robert, and Judge Anderson. The real books show systematic theft since 2009. Your grandmother's land was marked as their retirement project. The prosecutors studied Patricia's documents with growing excitement. One pulled Chen aside with a tablet, whispering urgently. Chen's eyebrows rose before he turned back to us. We just found a safe in Judge Anderson's home containing deeds to properties in multiple states, plus correspondence with HOA presidents nationwide. One letter from last month discusses expanding internationally. Here's what we're proposing, Chen said, shifting to practical matters. Federal receivership for all Anderson properties. Current homeowners in Willowbrook can stay as tenants while we sort the legal complexities. You'll receive full market value for your land, plus damages. The houses will be sold at auction, with proceeds going first to victims, then to the government. I thought about those 12 families. What happens to them long term? Chen's expression softened. Title insurance covers most losses. The Government Victim Fund handles the rest. They'll have the option to purchase their homes at fair market value once we clear titles, or relocate with full compensation. No innocent party suffers because of the Andersons' crimes. As we prepared to leave, Foster pulled me aside with a tablet. We executed a search warrant on your property this morning. Found something unexpected. The photographs showed underground storage areas beneath 3 houses. Hidden rooms accessed through the garages. Empty now, but forensics found traces of destroyed documents. We think they were hiding evidence related to other properties. The violation felt deeply personal. They'd built secret rooms on my grandmother's land to conceal crimes across the country. That evening, I met with journalists from the Los Angeles Times in Denise's conference room. They'd been investigating HOA corruption for 2 years and wanted to understand how we'd succeeded where others had failed. Most victims give up when they see official paperwork. I explained. They assume legal-looking documents mean legal actions, but my grandmother taught me to keep receipts, document everything, never trust authority without verification. The lead reporter, Janet Morrison, showed me their preliminary article. The headline read, "Federal Judge's Wife Led Multi-State Property Theft Ring." Below was a map dotted with red markers every known Anderson victim. We've identified 43 properties so far, she said. Your case broke it open, but the scope is staggering. They stole from elderly owners, immigrants who didn't understand American property law, anyone vulnerable. Denise interrupted with news from the federal receiver. Jonathan, they're moving fast on your property. The receiver wants to meet tomorrow about the restoration plan. Also, she smiled slightly. 3 of the Willowbrook families have already inquired about staying as legitimate buyers. They want to make this right. That night, I couldn't sleep. Instead, I drafted a proposal for the land's future. The 12 houses could remain those families were victims too, but the remaining acreage would return to agricultural preserve with permanent conservation easements, no future development. Ever. I included plans for a small memorial garden where my grandmother's favorite oak tree still stood. somehow spared by the construction. My phone rang at midnight. Patricia Coleman, sounding exhausted but relieved. "I wanted you to know 4 more board members from other HOAs have come forward. They're providing evidence about the training seminars Rachel ran. She called them property liberation workshops. Can you imagine? She turned stealing land into a teaching business." The next morning brought another wave of arrests. FBI agents, acting on Patricia's intelligence, raided HOA offices in Phoenix, Las Vegas, and San Diego. The news showed Rachel in federal custody, orange jumpsuit replacing her pastel blazers, as she was charged with 47 additional counts of fraud. Her empire hadn't just collapsed, it had exploded, taking down corrupt officials in multiple states. Chen called with updates. "The Swiss banks are cooperating. We've traced payments to officials in 5 states. This is becoming a Justice Department priority case. The Attorney General herself is monitoring." He paused. "Mr. Stewart, your testimony will be crucial. You're the first victim who fought back with enough evidence to win. Others are finding courage because of you." I spent the afternoon with the federal receiver, walking through Willowbrook Estates. Strange to see my grandmother's land transformed. But the houses were well built, the families who lived in them innocent of the crime that brought them there. "We'll make this right," the receiver assured me. "Clean titles for the families, fair compensation for you, and preservation of the remaining land. Justice doesn't have to be destructive." That evening, I sat in my apartment organizing documents for the trials ahead. Criminal proceedings against the Andersons and their network. Civil lawsuits to recover stolen assets. Congressional hearings about HOA oversight and judicial corruption. My phone buzzed with messages from victims across the country, thanking me for exposing what they'd suffered in silence. Tomorrow, I would meet with landscape architects about restoring the undeveloped portion of my grandmother's land. Native grasses would return. The oak groves would expand. The agricultural preserve she'd fought to create would finally become reality. The 12 families in Willowbrook would get clean titles and stable homes. And somewhere, perhaps, Dorothy Stewart's spirit would rest knowing her land was finally safe from those who saw only profit where she had seen promise. The war was won, but the peace would require careful construction, just as the Andersons had built their criminal empire methodically over years. We would dismantle it piece by piece, victim by victim, until justice reached everyone they'd wronged. My part was nearly done. The rest belonged to federal prosecutors, journalists, and a system finally awakened to the threat of corruption wearing HOA credentials and judicial robes. The federal courthouse in Los Angeles was a monument to justice, all marble and gravity. But on this Thursday morning, it thrummed with unusual energy. The courtroom assigned to United States versus Anderson et al. Had been upgraded to the largest available, and still people lined the hallways hoping for seats. I arrived with Denise at 7 a.m., 2 hours before the preliminary hearing, and already news vans circled the building like predators sensing blood. "Remember," Denise coached me as we cleared security, "this is just the arraignment and bail hearing. The real trials come later, but today sets the tone." She adjusted my tie with maternal efficiency. "Your testimony about finding those houses on your land is crucial. Tell it simply. Let the evidence speak." Inside the courtroom, the prosecution table looked like a war room. Michael Chen commanded a team of 6 federal prosecutors, plus specialists from the FBI, IRS, and Postal Inspection Service. The defense side was equally populated, 5 law firms representing various defendants. Though notably absent was any top-tier criminal defense attorney. The Andersons' frozen assets had limited their options to whoever would work for potential future payment. Judge Margaret Harrison, brought in from the Northern District to avoid any appearance of bias, took her seat precisely at 9. "Before we begin," she announced, "I want to address the media presence. This is a public proceeding. But I will not tolerate disruption. Any outbursts will result in removal. She surveyed the packed gallery, then proceeded with the case. The defendants were brought in separately. Rachel entered first, orange jumpsuit hanging on her diminished frame. Her perpetual smile replaced by a hollow stare. Robert followed, avoiding eye contact with everyone. But it was James Anderson who drew gasps, the federal judge in shackles, stripped of the robes that had given him power to enable his wife's crimes. Chen opened with devastating efficiency. Your Honor, the United States will show that the defendants orchestrated a 15-year criminal enterprise that stole over $40 million in property through fraud, intimidation, and corruption of public officials. This network operated in 17 states, teaching others to replicate their methods. He clicked a remote, displaying Willowbrook Estates on the courtroom screens. This development sits on land stolen from Jonathan Stewart while he was overseas. But this was just their latest crime in a pattern involving 43 properties. The defense attorneys tried various strategies. Rachel's lawyer claimed she was a passionate community developer who perhaps cut corners, but never intended harm. Robert's attorney painted him as a simple contractor, manipulated by his sister. James Anderson's lawyer faced the impossible task of defending a federal judge caught with millions in offshore accounts, arguing for willful blindness rather than active complicity. Judge Harrison's first major ruling came on the motion to freeze all Anderson assets globally. Given the evidence of offshore accounts and ongoing attempts to move money, I'm granting the government's motion for complete asset freeze. Every property, every account, every investment connected to any defendant is hereby frozen pending trial. Rachel's composure cracked as she whispered frantically to her lawyer. When my turn came to testify, the courtroom fell silent. I told the story methodically, returning from Dubai to find mansions on inherited land, discovering forged documents, uncovering the conspiracy. Chen guided me through each piece of evidence. But when we reached the hidden rooms beneath the houses, I felt the weight of violation fresh again. They built secret compartments on my grandmother's land to hide evidence of other crimes. She wanted that land preserved for nature. They turned it into a criminal headquarters. Patricia Coleman testified next, producing Rachel's real books. Properties were rated by vulnerability. Elderly owners got 3 stars. Preservation restrictions got 2. Absent owners got 5. Jonathan's land had 5 stars and a note, "Stewart heir, travels constantly. Perfect opportunity." She detailed the HOA's transformation under Rachel's leadership, from community organization to criminal enterprise, including monthly acquisition meetings where they identified new targets. The FBI's financial analyst delivered crucial testimony with charts tracing money flows. In 15 years, the defendants laundered approximately $140 million through this scheme. They paid taxes on less than 10%, defrauding the IRS of approximately $30 million. She showed how each stolen property fed the next acquisition, creating a self-funding criminal cycle that would have continued indefinitely without intervention. During the lunch break, negotiations began. Chen met with defense attorneys while Denise and I waited in a witness room. An hour later, Robert's attorney announced his client wanted to cooperate fully in exchange for leniency. My client was drawn into this scheme by family loyalty, but recognizes the severity of these crimes, he stated. Rachel visibly recoiled from her brother, while James Anderson's expression remained calculating and cold. The afternoon brought video testimony from other victims. An elderly woman in Phoenix described how her family farm, owned for 90 years, had been stolen through forged documents. An immigrant family in Nevada explained how their desert property, intended for their children's future, had been transformed into a golf course without their knowledge. Each story added weight to the prosecution's case, showing the human cost beyond mere property values. When the bail hearing commenced, The prosecution presented evidence of flight risk. James Anderson accessed offshore accounts from federal custody. Rachel Anderson holds dual citizenship with Ireland. Robert Anderson owns property in Costa Rica purchased with stolen funds. These defendants have the means and motivation to flee. The defense argued for house arrest with monitoring, but Judge Harrison was unmoved. Given the evidence presented, bail is denied for all defendants. The gavel came down with finality. Rachel sobbed quietly. Robert hung his head in defeat. James Anderson, who'd sent hundreds to prison from his federal bench, now faced the same fate. Marshals led them out in chains as cameras captured their downfall. After the hearing, Michael Chen addressed the media on the courthouse steps. Today marks the beginning of justice for dozens of families who lost property to this criminal enterprise. We will pursue every lead, investigate every transaction, and ensure accountability. He specifically thanked witnesses who came forward despite personal risk. I gave my own brief statement. My grandmother, Dorothy Stewart, believed in the law. She documented everything because she trusted that truth would eventually matter more than power or connections. Today proved her right. I hope other victims find courage to come forward. Justice may be slow, but it does arrive. The drive home took me past Willowbrook Estates, now transformed by federal intervention. The gates that had kept me out were gone, removed by court order. Without Rachel's arbitrary rules, families were outside talking to neighbors, children playing freely. A community meeting tonight, new board elections banner hung across the entrance. The HOA that had been a weapon was becoming what it should have been all along, neighbors working together. That evening, I found a package from Marcus Webb waiting at my apartment. Inside was a photograph I'd never seen my grandmother and a young girl planting trees on the land. Dated 1975. The girl held a tiny oak sapling, my grandmother guiding her hands to pack soil around its roots. Webb's note was brief. Dorothy hired me to protect her land, but she was really protecting the future. You honored that. The trees in this photo are the oaks that still stand in Willowbrook. Even thieves couldn't steal everything. I studied the photo, recognizing the spot despite the mansions now surrounding it. Those oak trees had survived development, their roots too deep to remove without destabilizing the million-dollar homes built around them. The developers' greed had forced them to preserve the very thing my grandmother had planted. There was poetry in that her legacy literally too rooted to steal completely. My phone buzzed with messages from reporters wanting follow-up interviews. From victims thanking me for exposing the scheme. From lawyers offering to help other families recover stolen property. Tomorrow would bring more hearings, more paperwork, more slow grinding toward justice. But tonight, I sat with that photograph, thinking about the young girl who'd helped plant trees in 1975. Whoever she was, those oaks had outlasted every scheme to destroy them. The Andersons had stolen land, built mansions, created a criminal empire that spanned states and destroyed lives. But they couldn't steal time, couldn't uproot what had grown too deep, couldn't erase the careful documentation of one elderly woman who'd seen them coming. In the end, paper trails and patient truth had proven stronger than corruption and connections. The oak trees stood, the criminals sat in federal custody, and somewhere, my grandmother's belief in justice was finally, fully vindicated. The federal investigation exploded outward like ripples in a pond. Friday morning, just 24 hours after the Andersons were denied bail, FBI agents executed coordinated raids across 5 states. I watched from my apartment as the news showed HOA offices surrounded from Phoenix to Atlanta. Computers seized. Officials led away in handcuffs. Michael Chen called at 8 a.m. with urgency in his voice. "Jonathan, we need you back at the federal building. The forensic accountants found something in James Anderson's records that requires immediate action." Denise met me in the parking garage, her expression grim. Chen wouldn't say what over the phone, but he's assembled the entire prosecution team. The conference room buzzed with controlled chaos. Chen stood before a whiteboard, covered in connections, that looked like a spider's web. "Mr. Stewart, what we're about to share is confidential to this investigation, but you need to know as the primary victim." He gestured to the board. James Anderson wasn't just funding his wife's schemes, he was selling judicial decisions. Chen continued, "We found encrypted communications on a laptop hidden in his chambers. For 10 years. He's been taking payments to influence cases, property disputes, criminal sentences, corporate litigation." Agent Foster pulled up financial records on the main screen. $23 million in payments traced so far, routed through the same Nevada LLCs. He coded them. Property cases were Project Home. Criminal cases were Project Freedom. Corporate disputes were Project Market. We've identified 17 cases where outcomes correlate directly with payments. The implications staggered everyone present. Denise grabbed my arm. "Your lawsuit exposed systematic corruption at the federal judiciary level." Chen nodded grimly. "We're coordinating with the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section. By Monday, this will be the biggest judicial corruption case in American history." Robert Anderson's attorney arrived with his client's first cooperation session results. Robert had provided detailed records, but more importantly revealed the blueprint, a handbook Rachel created for replicating their scheme. "She runs seminars," Robert explained through his attorney, "called them property liberation workshops, charged $5,000 per attendee, taught them how to identify targets, compromise officials, structure transactions. Based on the attendance records, we're looking at over 100 trained conspirators nationwide." By noon, Rachel Anderson's attorney requested an emergency meeting. "My client has information about judicial corruption beyond her husband. She can provide names, dates, and documentation for judges in multiple jurisdictions." Chen's response was measured. "We'll listen. But Mrs. Anderson needs to understand cooperation might reduce her sentence from 30 years to 20. She's not walking away from this." The afternoon brought a breakthrough from Thomas Wright, the former county clerk, facing 20 years. He confessed and revealed where he'd hidden originals. "I kept copies of everything as insurance. There's a storage unit in Riverside with boxes of real preservation documents, original deeds, correspondence about targeting specific properties." Within hours, agents recovered 15 boxes, proving systematic document fraud going back 2 decades. I met with Margaret Phillips, the federal receiver assigned to untangle the Anderson assets. "Mr. Stewart, we're proposing to convert Willowbrook Estates into a legitimate HOA with current residents as members. They'll own their homes free and clear after paying fair market value into a victim restitution fund. You'll receive full compensation plus damages, plus ownership of the undeveloped portion." "What about the hidden rooms?" I asked. Phillips smiled grimly. "Being converted to storage, the FBI found destroyed documents relating to 62 properties. Even meticulous criminals can't destroy everything." Chen gathered the prosecution team for a final Friday briefing. "Monday, we announce expanded indictments. 93 defendants across 17 states. RICO charges for primary conspirators. Tax evasion for anyone who profited. Public corruption for every official who took bribes." He looked at me directly. "Mr. Sir Stewart, your refusal to accept the theft has exposed corruption that might have continued for decades." That evening, I visited Willowbrook Estates at the invitation of the newly formed Residents Committee. Without Rachel's oppressive control, children played freely and neighbors gathered without fear. They'd voted to keep the name, but add a subtitle, "Willowbrook Estates, a Community Reborn." Patricia Coleman met me at what had been Rachel's house, now serving as a temporary community center. "We want to make this right," she said, gesturing to gathered residents. "We benefited unknowingly from crime. We're creating a fund to help other victims of property fraud. seeded with voluntary contributions from each household. As I drove home, my phone rang. Marcus Webb's gravelly voice came through clearly. "Watching the news, seeing those judges in handcuffs. Your grandmother once told me, 'Marcus, they think they're stealing land, but they're really stealing time. And time always gets paid back with interest. Looks like the interest is compounding nicely.'" His words carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled. The weekend brought a cascade of new developments. Saturday morning, the IRS announced it was auditing every business entity connected to the Andersons. Property owners across the country came forward with suspicious transactions. State bar associations opened ethics investigations. What had started as my fight for 5 acres had become a reckoning for an entire shadow industry of property theft. Chen called Saturday evening with updates. James Anderson tried to make a deal, offered to reveal every corrupt judge he knows in exchange for minimum security placement. We said no deals until he provides the information. He gave us 11 names just to show good faith. This goes deeper than we imagined. Sunday's newspapers carried extensive investigations. The Los Angeles Times had traced connections between Anderson-trained HOA presidents and suspicious property transfers in 9 states. The Wall Street Journal analyzed the financial networks, estimating total theft at over $200 million. The New York Times profiled victims, including a 90-year-old woman whose farm had been stolen while she was in hospice care. By Sunday night, I found myself standing in my apartment, looking at the stack of documents that had started everything. My grandmother's deed, the agricultural preserve papers, the photos Webb had taken. Such simple pieces of paper, but they'd brought down an empire built on greed and corruption. Tomorrow would bring the expanded indictments, more arrests, years of trials and appeals. The legal machinery would grind slowly but thoroughly. I thought about the 12 families in Willowbrook Estates, innocent purchasers who'd bought into a crime without knowing it. They'd have clean deeds soon, legitimate ownership of homes they'd made their own. The undeveloped portion would return to agricultural preserve, protected forever from development. Not perfect justice, nothing could undo the violation of building on stolen land. But perhaps something better. A community transformed, corruption exposed, future victims protected. The Andersons sat in federal custody tonight, their empire reduced to evidence bags and indictment counts. They'd believed power and connections made them untouchable, that careful documentation and patient schemes could transform theft into ownership. They'd been wrong. In the end, truth had proven more patient than their crimes, justice more persistent than their corruption, and one software engineer's refusal to accept theft more powerful than all their careful plans. My phone buzzed with a final message from Chen. Grand jury convenes at 8 a.m. 93 indictments ready. Thank you for not giving up. And I set the phone aside and prepared for bed. The war was won. Though battles remained, tomorrow, the legal avalanche would continue its descent, sweeping away corruption wherever it had taken root. But tonight, I could rest knowing that my grandmother's land was safe, her faith in justice vindicated, and her patient documentation had brought down more than thieves. It had exposed a cancer in the American justice system itself. The interest on stolen time had indeed come due, and the payment was everything the Andersons had built on lies. 6 months later, on a crisp April morning, I stood on my grandmother's land for the signing ceremony that would finally close this chapter. The 12 Mediterranean mansions still gleamed in the California sun. But everything else had changed. Where Rachel Anderson's HOA signs once proclaimed private property, new markers designated the Dorothy Stewart Agricultural Preserve. The ceremony took place beneath the oak trees, their shade sheltering folding chairs and a simple podium. Denise Walker reviewed the final settlement documents, $547,000 for the land value. $2.3 million in damages, annual rent from the 12 properties totaling $420,000, plus permanent ownership of 32 undeveloped acres. The numbers were staggering, but what mattered most was that justice had arrived in full. Michael Chen took the podium at 10. 6 months ago, Jonathan Stewart's refusal to accept theft exposed one of the largest judicial corruption schemes in American history. Today, we make right what was stolen. The signing proceeded efficiently. I transferred the developed portion to the new legitimate HOA while keeping the preserve. Each family received real deeds after paying fair market value into the Victim Restitution Fund. Patricia Coleman approached afterward, tears in her eyes. Your grandmother would be so proud. We've voted to create a community garden in her honor, if you'll permit it, a place where neighbors can grow things together, the way she intended. I agreed immediately. Dorothy Stewart had always shared her vegetables. Now neighbors would share the growing. Chen provided the criminal update everyone awaited. Rachel Anderson pled guilty 22 years federal time. James Anderson went to trial and received 35 years. At 63, it's effectively life. Robert got 12 for cooperation. Thomas Wright, 8 years. He paused. We've reviewed 3,000 cases James presided over. 47 convictions vacated. 3 innocent people released from federal prison. The ripple effects continue. The new HOA president, David Park, presented their community charter with transparency requirements, term limits, and multiple signatures for financial decisions. What happened here will never happen again. Marcus Webb stood quietly observing, finally approaching as the crowd dispersed. Your grandmother hired me to document crime, but what she really documented was faith that truth matters, that patience wins. He handed me an envelope. Final report. Case closed. After the officials left, I walked to the preserve boundary. 32 acres of California grassland, protected forever by conservation easements no future scheme could break. Spring wildflowers were blooming poppies, lupines, and yarrow painting the hills in color my grandmother had fought to protect. Behind me, Willowbrook Estates had transformed into a real community. Children played in yards their parents now legitimately owned. Someone was grilling dinner, the smell mixing with wild sage. My phone held messages from journalists, prosecutors, and victims thanking me for giving them courage to fight their own HOA battles. But I silenced it all, focusing on the sunset painting, the preserve gold. Tomorrow would bring more legal proceedings the Anderson network had spread wide. Tonight was for gratitude. I thought of Rachel in federal prison. Her HOA presidency traded for an inmate number. James Anderson, once deciding fates from the bench, now counting days from a cell. They'd built their crime so carefully that its own construction became victim compensation. My rent checks would fund conservation efforts and legal aid for other property fraud victims in perpetuity. As darkness settled, I made my way past houses built on stolen dreams, but now standing on legitimate foundations. The Andersons had thought they were building an empire. Instead, they'd constructed their own downfall so thoroughly that their victims now lived in homes paid for by justice. Somewhere in federal prison, 3 people who'd believed themselves untouchable were learning that patient truth outlasts clever lies. Every time. My grandmother's faith in keeping receipts, documenting everything, and trusting the law had been vindicated completely. The land was safe, the criminals contained, and the community reborn not through power or connections, but through the simple act of refusing to let a lie become truth.